Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing very well. So, we've been asked in DCS if you change the ambient temperature from hot to cold or cold to hot, does it affect the performance of the engines in DCS? So in DCS, controllable planes, we've got turbojets, we've got turbofans like in this plane, and we've got piston engines in the World War II planes. And the answer is, at least in real life, yes, the performance of the engine, how much power it can make, which is what an engine has to do at the end of the day, is heavily affected by the ambient temperature. The logic behind it is relatively simple. An engine, an air-breathing engine, any air-breathing engine, can only suck in a certain volume, cubic meterage of air per second. Air is the fluid that's all around us. It is actually a fluid. I know it contains gases, but it is known as a fluid. And one of the gases it contains is oxygen. And oxygen is the thing that is burnt in an engine here to produce power. If there was no oxygen in the fluid known as air, none of these air-breathing engines could work. Now, what we know is that when the ambient temperature goes up for a given altitude, and everything's going to be done at sea level for this experiment just to keep everything static, then the air density and the air pressure goes down. If the density of the air goes down, then the quantity of the oxygen gas per cubic meter of the fluid air is less. And bearing in mind the engine can only suck in a certain amount of volume of air, then with less oxygen in the warmer air, the engine will make less power. So we're going to test this today. Now, I thought it would be a very easy thing to test, but it's turned out to be actually a complicated thing to test. I thought it would take half an hour. It's actually taken all day. I've been at this for 5 hours now. And so what I'll first do is explain test 1. Now, I'm not going to show you test 1 because it's just a waste of your time now, as test 1 did not have very good results. So we'll talk about that because it's important to talk about that. Then we'll talk about test 2, which is what I'm in this aeroplane here to do. That's a much more important test and a much more relevant test. And then we're going to go do test 3, which is in a helicopter. So with test 1, the idea is I take a Hornet up and I fly it at sea level. First in Caucasus at plus 8 degrees centigrade, and then I fly the same Hornet in the Persian Gulf at plus 41 degrees centigrade. And with an identical Hornet, we see the maximum speed difference at sea level. The idea being in my mind that the more power the engine would create, the faster the aircraft would go, and that would be a good way of demonstrating to you guys that DCS does model engine power differential with changes in ambient temperature. Now, after that test, the results were on the Caucasus with plus 8 degrees centigrade at sea level and a set ballast of stores that I had, and with fuel burn turned off, I managed to achieve 596 knots ground speed. And the ground speed part of that is very important because it negates air temperature from affecting the speed measurement as you would get in calibrator or indicated airspeed. Then when the temperature was ramped up to 41 degrees centigrade, the top speed of the aircraft came down as expected, because you know if it's going to get hotter we're going to make less power, there's less oxygen to burn, but it only came down to 589 knots. That's a delta of 7 knots. That's a very small difference for a very high change in ambient temperature of 32 degrees centigrade, and that annoyed me. And the reason it annoyed me is because one of my many jobs I've had in my lifetime was tuning performance gasoline automobile engines. And one thing I can tell you from my experience in tuning performance gasoline automobile engines is that a relatively small change in ambient temperature gives a large power decrease. So when we saw a delta of 7 knots with a delta of 32 degrees centigrade, it's 33 degrees centigrade in the Hornet, that was frustrating. And to put that into percentage terms, the difference was 1.18%. So basically 1% performance in our delta speed. And I've concluded that that is a null and void test in the end, because what we were doing there by testing the max speed of the aircraft within given parameters is not just testing the power of the engines, it's also testing the drag of the aircraft. And what we found is that as the temperature increased, yes, the engines did lose power, but because the air density was lower, the airframe drag became lower, and that made the aircraft go faster. So what we found is the change in temperature doesn't really affect the speed of the aircraft, because the loss of power created by higher temperatures was nullified by the decrease in airframe drag. So they more or less cancel each other out. So in terms of speed and ambient temperature, it only has about a 1% effect, slightly varies over different airframes due to drag coefficients and whatnot. So that was test 1. We've declared that void. It was very interesting to do, and that actually created some interesting questions that I want to ask you guys, but maybe we'll leave that for a different time. That moves us on to the second test, this one here, which is a replacement for that first test. And so with this second test, what we want to do is strip away speed. We don't want any speed. Speed is causing problems because it introduces things like drag and lift changes. And we can do that. So to nullify speed, what we can do is keep our aircraft static. And I'll show you how we can do that in a minute. And as well as negating effects from drag and lift, we can also negate another important effect which would make this test very difficult. Now, another problem with testing engine power in aircraft, now this is not so much a problem with cars, but in aircraft, the speed at which you're going at drastically affects the power of the engine. So if we ignore the aeroplane for a minute, ignore the airframe, just think about the engine moving through the air. If that's happening, the faster the engine goes through the air, the less power it makes. And that's due to how a jet engine works, and it's very different from a piston engine in those terms. A turbojet or a turbofan, like in this aircraft, works by the basic physics of change of momentum. It sucks air in at the front and it blows it out faster. That gives a change in momentum which pushes the engine forward. So that change in momentum, or delta momentum, becomes less as the aircraft moves faster through the air. That's just how it works. And so an engine, if it was going fast enough, one of these engines, if it was going fast enough, would go all the way down to 0 power. And hence why you can't really test the power of an engine in an aircraft. To test the power, you have to take the engine out, strap it to a rig and fire it up so that it can't move. And that's what we're going to do today. All we're going to do is press the pause button, the active pause, which stops our aircraft from moving. That's literally what it does. And I can still rev my engines up to max burn. We now have a way of measuring our static thrust at sea level. When I say sea level, we're near enough sea level. We're about 50 feet actually above sea level, near enough. At this point you're probably saying, but how? There's no measurement in DCS to actually tell you your real-time static thrust. Oh, but there is. And the logic for this comes back to automobiles and tuning automobile engines. So automobile engines measure the amount of oxygen being sucked in to the piston, to the cylinder, and then they squirt in the correct amount of fuel per that amount of oxygen in the cylinder to give a uniform burn ratio. So for instance, with a gasoline engine at cruise, I mean this changes slightly at different throttle levels, but at cruise, for instance, you'll be burning 14.7 airs per gasoline at any engine speed to create the perfect burn. In a gasoline engine, this is known as a stoichiometric ratio. Now, I don't know what the essential stoichiometric ratio of burn of a turbofan is like this, but what I can say is that the logic still stands true. This engine here, or any air-breathing engine here, will measure the amount of oxygen, not the amount of fluid, not the amount of air, the amount of oxygen, and you can do that with O2 sensors like you'll have in your car. Coming into the engine, it will then squirt the correct amount of fuel in to create the correct ratio of fuel to air for this particular type of engine, whatever it is, we don't know what that ratio is, which will then burn and create power. So the logic goes, as with automobile engines, to measure the amount of power produced, all you need to do is measure the amount of fuel burned. The amount of power produced is proportional to the amount of fuel burned. So when I used to tune car engines, I told the customers their net resultant power, not by putting it on a rolling road and measuring tyre resistance, but by telling them the amount of fuel that they burned at a certain engine speed with a static fuel burn ratio and then correcting for errors like actual leakage of their engine, and it can give them an almost perfectly accurate power of that combustion engine. And the same thing is going to happen here. So all that was just a very long-winded of saying we're going to look at the fuel burn at an ambient temperature of 8 degrees. We're going to look at a fuel burn at an ambient temperature of 41 degrees. And then we're going to take a percentage difference between those fuel burns, and that is going to tell us the power decrease as we go from a colder ambient temperature to a hotter ambient temperature. And what I expect to see is a delta more like the delta we see in a automobile engine as the ambient temperature increases, of about 10% or something. Okay, so let me check I've got pause on. I have. Spool the engines up, suck that gas in. What we're looking at here is fuel flow. Now, I can't actually remember in the Hornet I think this is pounds per engine per minute. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It doesn't actually matter because we're not actually getting a static thrust. We're just getting a percentage thrust. So what we've got is 200. Oops, sorry, that's still going. We've got 273 is the amount of fuel flow in these engines, essentially proportional to the static thrust at 8 degrees ambient temperature at sea level in the Caucasus. Now we're going to go over to the Persian Gulf and ratchet the speed up, but otherwise repeat the test. We're now all the way up to 41 degrees centigrade at sea level. Now don't worry about what it says there regards our altitude. We are not at 1,500 feet. The reason why that reads like that, and I think I may need to either do another video on that or maybe something at the end of this video, is because although the temperature has massively increased and the density of the air at sea level decreased, I've kept the same QNH Q value of 29.92 inches mercury. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say stuff like that, but again, maybe we'll do something at the end of that video. But I can assure you, at Abu Dhabi, we are about 40 feet above sea level, or thereabouts. I'm going to just repeat the same thing. No need to talk. Active pause on. Rev the engines up. Let's see how they model it. Sure we're not moving. No, we're not. And that's it. Off power. 245. So at 8 degrees ambient temperature, we could get 273, and at 41 degrees centigrade, so a 33 delta degrees, we've got 245 fuel burn, which is, as we know, proportional to power created. Therefore, if I put that in a calculator, that is just over 11% delta power compared to the 33 degrees delta ambient temperature. Another way of saying that is by increasing the ambient temperature by 33 degrees, we've lost 11.5% of our net thrust. And that is much more in line with what I saw in real life with an automobile. And like I said before, that does not mean you're going to go 11.5% slower. Although we've got 11% less thrust, we've got 11% less drag or thereabouts. So it roughly equals itself out in terms of actual movement. So you probably won't feel any difference in the cockpit, or very limited difference. And that moves us on to lift. Now lift and ambient temperature, I'm going to cover it in another video because we're just going to get too complicated if we put that in this video. We're just going to look at engine performance. So to summarise, with a turbofan or a turbojet, it is modelled, and it is modelled to my experience very accurately as to real life. The next thing we're going to do is, I should say as well, I have tried different aircraft. I've tried a Mirage, I tried something else, and they all had not perfectly the same, but almost the same result as we saw there. So next we're going to do helicopters, and comparing helicopters to airplanes is difficult. Technically it's got the same type of engine, it's got a a turbine type engine, but it's the way the net product is going to be measured very differently. I mean, this engine here doesn't actually create any power at all, really, in terms of what power actually means in physics. So if you think of horsepower in a car or shaft horsepower in a helicopter, that is true power. This engine here doesn't actually really make any net power. What it does make is thrust, and that's very different, but maybe that's for a different video. We're just going to call it power for the sake of this video in terms of engine performance. So now we're going to go over to a helicopter and have a look at that. Okay, so back to the Caucasus, back to ambient temperature plus 8 degrees centigrade. We're in our helicopter now. The helicopter, I can assure you, will suffer from exactly the same performance degradation as the F-18 Hornet or as the other types of aircraft that I've tested. But I've got no way of really empirically showing it to you. You're just going to have to take my word for it. And as well as that, testing a helicopter is very difficult because what we cannot factor out is the degradation in lift as ambient temperature increases. So as ambient temperature increases, the lift created by our rotor blades is going to change, and that's going to kind of pollute the results of this test. But what I can show you is what I think is actually a bit more important, and it's another part of the engine performance puzzle that I want to teach you about today, and that is exhaust gas temperature effect by ambient temperature. So we're not going to look at power, we're not going to look at shaft horsepower, we're not going to look at fuel burn rate. With this time we're going to look at engine gas temperature. So if you're a Huey pilot, you'll know that your life is basically commanded as a Huey pilot by this gauge here. You always have one eye on this gauge here, and it controls everything that you do. And this is telling us the exhaust temperature of our turbine engine, and the performance of what we can actually really do in the real world in terms of flying, climbing, speed, everything is governed by our exhaust gas temperature, which is heavily affected by ambient temperature, as you expect, probably even more so than it affects the actual power output or the thrust output in the F-18 and the shaft horsepower output in this Huey here. So it's going to do a very simple layman's test. We've got a fully loaded up Huey, fully fueled, 4 miniguns, 2 rocket pods. Basically it's overweight, and let's see what we can actually do in terms of layman's flying while keeping our exhaust gas temperatures under the red. If we go up to the red, essentially our engine will explode. Okay, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that is in layman's how the Huey works. So we're not actually flying yet, we're getting something called ground effect. So let's keep going. Still not quite flying. More power. What I'm doing is I'm not increasing the throttle is at maximum, I'm just increasing the collective. It works very differently to an aeroplane. Now we're flying. That's no longer a ground effect. And look at the gauge. It is still well within the red. So we're still safe. Amber. We can do amber for a few minutes. And look, we're climbing. We can climb. It's sluggish. It's not very nice to fly, but it works. Okay. Now what we're going to do is ramp up the ambient temperature, jump over to the desert, and see what effect it has on our exhaust gas temperatures. Okay, we're in identical Huey. All we've done is ramp the the ambient temperature up, and let's see how we get on. And that's it. We're at amber, and we're not even slightly starting to lift. What we can say is a Huey with this weight can't take off in this ambient temperature. You just can't do it. Got a tiny bit of ground effect there. That's I can assure you that's not flying, and it's not gonna lift off from the ground. And the reason for that is complicated. It's not just engine. It's also to do with the way the rotors interact with the air and cause resistance, cause lift, and whatnot. But the important thing here that I'm trying to point out with the helicopter is how the ambient temperature can affect your exhaust gas temperature to a point at which it affects your ability to fly, and especially in a helicopter, very important. It may be very important to an aeroplane as well, I'm not sure, but in a helicopter you're trained obviously to watch your exhaust gas temperatures. So massive difference. That's it. So in conclusion, if I've got my maths right, you are going to lose about 0.35% of your thrust if you're in a turbojet or a turbofan aircraft, about 0.35% of your thrust per every increase in 1% of ambient temperature at sea level. So that's something to bear in mind. And although it may not affect your speed that much, it will drastically affect your maneuverability. And especially in a helicopter, like we've shown here, due to exhaust gas temperature reasons, it will drastically affect your flying performance, or what is possible to do. So that's it. That's all I really wanted to show. I think we can all agree after that the DCS does appear to have modelled it pretty accurately to real life. They've probably done it just in terms of physics, and that's perfectly good. Now, I did promise I'll just show you one quick thing. It's just something I've learned while doing these tests, and that is if I go to, in the mission editor, I go to the environment here. So what I've been doing is changing the degrees here, and that has been changing with it the density of the air and the air pressure, in particular, I should say, at sea level. This guy here, the QNH here, which essentially means the air pressure at sea level, if you change that, and you can change it to whatever you want, it doesn't actually affect the density of the air in the actual game. All it seems to do is be a kind of Q value that affects your instruments. So whereas I thought changing the QNH in DCS meant actually changing the physical world, it doesn't. It just means changing your base instrument QNH. It's just something I wanted to tag along there and see what you guys think of that, or see if maybe you thought I've got that wrong, but I've done thorough experimentation with this QNH here. Right, that's it. Hope you enjoyed that. See you later.